choices and be at liberty to define themselves and who they are. And what I'm referring to is what historians call the market revolution, or sometimes they might describe it as the industrial revolution. The market revolution generally refers to the period of really exceptional growth and creativity that occurred in the first half of the 19th century in the American economy. And what I'd like to argue this morning is that it was a series of changes that were not only economic, but also social and political and cultural, and that the overall effect was that it really was a great thing for regular people, for ordinary Americans. That is not an uncontested view. There are people out there who think that the market revolution is something that brought about great hardship for Americans. There are people out there who thought that it brought about great dislocation for Americans. That's probably the dominant version that you find in American history textbooks, for example. So I'm arguing against that. And I think that the argument against that is frankly really pretty potent and kind of even pretty obvious. So that's what I'm up to up here. But because I love the American Revolution so much, I have to begin with these guys. And we have here, of course, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two lions of the American Revolution. As you all know, Jefferson and Adams are important individuals really throughout the entire revolutionary period. They're both involved in the run-up to independence. They're both members of the Continental Congress. There at the Continental Congress, they were sort of the Batman and Robin of independence, you know? Thomas Jefferson was the pen of independence. John Adams was the extremely big mouth of independence. Adams argued for independence for months before the Continental Congress was ready to sign off on it. Jefferson was selected to write the Declaration for three reasons, according to John Adams. Adams said, reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business. Reason second, you can write 10 times better than I can. Reason third, I, John Adams, am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular, and you are very much otherwise. So yeah, Adams was one of those guys. But they were good friends, and they had, in many respects, parallel careers. Jefferson went back to Virginia. Adams went back to Massachusetts. They helped draft the fundamental documents of their newly independent states. They helped to lead their states. Adams and Jefferson then would be sent abroad as diplomats. Adams would end up as our ambassador to Britain. Jefferson, of course, would succeed Benjamin Franklin as our ambassador to France. They traveled around Europe together. I mean, these guys were tight, you know? Backpacks, youth hostels, right? They went to Stratford-on-Avon, and even back then, William Shakespeare's house was a tourist attraction. And there, they paid whatever it cost to get in, and they stood, I think, alone in Shakespeare's study. And Jefferson looked at Shakespeare's chair and reached into his pocket and pulled out a pocket knife. And he went up to Shakespeare's chair and he sort of whittled off a little piece of wood. And then he whittled off another little piece of wood. And he took one piece and he put it in his pocket. And he took the other piece and he handed it to Adams. BFF! You know? It was like nothing could separate them. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make sure everyone's awake. Including, especially myself. And yet, politics would come between these two men. When they returned back to America, Adams was the first vice president of the United States. Jefferson was Secretary of State in the administration of George Washington. Politics certainly did divide them. This was a time when people of different political persuasions would cross the street to avoid running into one another. Jefferson would run against Adams for the presidency in 1796 when he narrowly lost. He ran against Adams again in 1800 when he narrowly won. Adams was so ticked off that he didn't even go to Jefferson's inauguration. He got on a stagecoach at like 1 in the morning on March 4th, 1801, the day that Jefferson got inaugurated, and took off for Massachusetts. And the two didn't really speak until they started to resume their correspondence at the urging of their mutual friend, a guy named Benjamin Rush, in 1813. And then you couldn't turn it off. I mean, they wrote all these long letters to one another, really brilliant, really insightful, and they spoke about a lot of things. They spoke about the history of the American Revolution. They spoke about philosophy and religion and just about every subject that you could imagine. But one of the things that they spoke about was the present and the future, and how, from their standpoint, and by this point they're kind of like, get off my lawn, curmudgeonly old men, but from their standpoint, how profoundly disorienting it was. How profoundly, almost alienating it was to see all the changes around them. It seemed as if time was moving faster. It seemed as if the world was changing so rapidly that they couldn't even keep up with it. Adams and Jefferson lived long lives that, in many respects, paralleled each other. They also died in a way that brought them together. Jefferson down in Virginia, Adams up in Massachusetts. Both of these guys were really getting up there. Both of them were in failing health in June and in July of 1776. Jefferson down at Monticello expressed a wish that he would live to see the 4th of July. He started slipping in and out of consciousness. At his bedside were his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, his grandson-in-law, a guy named Nicholas P. Trist, who was a West Point dropout, who would later go on to negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which brought the Southwest into the United States after the Mexican War, as well as his doctor, Dr. Rob McDonald, an unusual name. And Jefferson kept waking up and saying, "Is it the 4th?" And they didn't want to lie to the guy, so they kept having to shake their heads, "No." And every time Jefferson asked, his voice would get weaker, and his health grew more shaky. "Is it the 4th?" "No." "Is it the 4th?" he asked on the night of the 3rd. And Trist just couldn't bear to disappoint the guy again, and he could go at any moment, and so he lied. He said, "Yeah, it's the 4th." And a lot of historians say that, "Is it the 4th?" that those are Jefferson's last words. They're not, actually, because then Dr. Dungleson offered Jefferson another dose of what they at least believed to be life-sustaining medication. And Jefferson turned to Dungleson and said, "No, doctor, nothing more." Now that would be a really crappy story if Jefferson on the spot right there died, right? On July 3rd. That would be lousy. But the good news is, he lived. He lived until about noon the next day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the hour of the Continental Congress's ratification of the Declaration of Independence. And if that's not striking enough, the rest of the story is that up in Braintree, Massachusetts, John Adams was also on his deathbed. And he died around 5 p.m. when the Declaration was first publicly proclaimed in 1776. And Adams's last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." And I'd like to think that as Jefferson was being borne heavenward on the wings of angels, he was laughing his ass off, because even in death, he once again proved John Adams wrong. But I'd also like to think that in some respects, John Adams was right, that Jefferson does survive in a lot of important ways. And one of those is that people have been able, in various ways, to pursue happiness and define themselves and be who they wanted to be in a particularly, perhaps, American way that was, even then, just sort of dawning upon people. Wherever you went in 1776, news traveled slowly. It took 2 months to get across the ocean. It took 2 weeks for the news of the ratification of the Declaration to travel by horseback up to Boston. But when Jefferson died, news of his death reached Boston not on horseback, but by steamboat. And the dignitaries at Adams's funeral, as soon as they laid him to rest, they walked a short distance to a ribbon-cutting ceremony that officially opened the first stretch of railroad track between the Quincy, Massachusetts quarry and the future site of the Bunker Hill Monument. And down at Jefferson's grave site, when he was laid to rest, when the students from the University of Virginia walked up the hill to Monticello, standing above Jefferson's grave, right, looking down into this hole in the ground containing this fallen pillar of the Enlightenment. Standing there was a young man who would become a University of Virginia dropout and a West Point dropout, and perhaps our greatest romantic poet. Anyone know who he was? Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, think about that. Talk about like a sign of the times changing. Poe burying Jefferson. What different individuals, what different times they represent. And certainly, this was a different time, a different age that was dawning. The market revolution and the society that it brought out. Now again, I say that it was a good thing. Others suggest otherwise. This is a quotation from the textbook that I use, that I assign in my classes at West Point. The textbook, it's called Nation of Nations. You know, it's a good textbook overall. Things about it I like, things about it I don't like. I think it's fine that it contains things with which I disagree. It makes it more interesting to teach out of. But this is what the authors of Nation of Nations have to say about the market revolution. They say, with the restructuring of work and opportunity by the market revolution, wealth became much more unevenly distributed in American society. Social mobility still existed, but it was more limited than boosters of the day claimed. As the economy lurched up and down, individuals were at the mercy of economic forces beyond their control. Implied there is jackbooted economic forces, right? And it's easy to see why people might fall victim to the temptation to think that the market revolution really was a time of great hardship for people. It almost seems as if it would have to be that way when you think about how quickly the United States grew in terms of population. I mean, check this out. We had less than 4 million people at the time of the first federal census in 1790. By 1860, we have more than 30 million people. Whoa, right? I mean, we know we added land in the West and stuff and all that good, but still, our population is growing much faster than the territory that we occupy. I mean, what must be the result of this? I'm getting really correct answers from the front. But I think what most people would say is scarcity, starvation, want, poverty. You know? All these people putting demands on a nation that hasn't grown in size enough to keep up with their demands. You know? And yet, we know the reality. If the population of the United States grows almost tenfold during this period, real GDP per capita doubles. People are twice as rich at the end of this period than they were at the beginning. That's really pretty remarkable when you think about it. How did that happen? What were the consequences of that? That's the story that I'd like to tell. It could begin in a couple of different spots. But one spot that certainly was an important scene of the market revolution was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was built between 1818 and 1825. It was 365 miles long, easy number to remember, and it stretched from Albany to Buffalo. In other words, what it did is it connected the Great Lakes, the area of America that used to be thought of as the hinterland, that used to be called the back country. It connected the Great Lakes with Albany and the Hudson River and New York City and the Atlantic Ocean and the rest of the world. It turned the back country into the frontier. It made an area that had been economically isolated, economically cut off, economically integrated. The cost of transportation plummeted. It went from 19 cents a mile before the Erie Canal to 3 cents a mile and eventually to 1 cent per mile. And the Erie Canal increased the speed of transportation between the Great Lakes and New York City fivefold. You think about what that makes possible. How that improves the lives of the people who lived back there, out there, as well as the people who lived in places like New York City. New York City, at the time of our independence, was not the largest city in the United States. Philadelphia was the largest city in the United States. Philadelphia, in fact, was the second largest English-speaking city in the world. Anyone want to guess how many people it had?
600,000.
600,000. Is that too high or too low? You think it's too low? Too high? 100,000? 50,000? 30,000. 30,000 people in the second largest English-speaking city on the planet. Why? Why so small? Why couldn't cities be larger? Why couldn't more people come together? They needed to feed themselves. You know? The more people you got gathered in one spot, the farther out you would need to go to get food. And yet, the farther out you needed to go, the more expensive the food became. The more likely it was that by the time the food reached the city, it would be rotten, it would be spoiled. And what about water? What about basic necessities like firewood or coal or what have you? And it was because of limits in transportation that cities were so small. After the Erie Canal, though, New York City would catapult forward as America's largest city and quickly have more than 1 million people. I'm going to do questions at the end, if that's okay, unless it's really urgent. So you've got the Erie Canal taking care of a problem that had kind of daunted people from time immemorial, which was, it's great to live near the coast, it's great to live on navigable rivers, because from there you have access to the market. From there you can grow crops and trade with others and export and import and all that good stuff. But what about when you get above the fall line? What happens when you hit whitewater rapids? That land which was once almost practically worthless, which was certainly really cut off from the market, now is opened up to it. And it's not just the Erie Canal in New York, but canals all over the United States that are making this happen. And in addition to canals, we also have things like steamboats. If you were a cadet at West Point in 1808, you would have seen this odd sort of sight. They were marshaling on the parade ground, on the plain, and a bunch of cadets wrote in letters how they saw this big plume of smoke rising from the Hudson River. What could it be? And they kind of rushed over and they looked down the cliffside, and there was this ship without sails, moving upstream quickly. A steamboat. A steamboat. I mean, rivers were the superhighways of commerce in the 18th century and early into the 19th century. But the problem was, rivers generally moved just in one direction. So it's great if you're going downstream, but it's not so awesome if you're going upstream. That takes a long time. Before steamboats, it took something like 90 days to go from New Orleans to St. Louis. Afterwards, it took a week. I mean, think about what that makes possible. People in Missouri could eat seafood, you know? And the amount of competition that people could enjoy increased. The number of businesses with which you could work, the number of people with whom you could trade increased. So prices went down. People suddenly could afford to eat more and eat better. People had more stuff. People lived longer. The quality of people's lives improved. And with the advent of railroads, that process only accelerated. So transportation innovation vastly expanded the marketplace in a quantum sort of way that maybe we can't appreciate because we can appreciate what the internet has done. Right? With the internet, you could buy stuff from everywhere. It's a worldwide market. You could compare and compare and compare. Variety is almost limitless. It's that sort of bounty that these advances in transportation began to make possible. So transportation was a big part of this. Another big part of this was an invention that was probably the best and the worst thing ever to happen in American history. And that's the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. The cotton gin basically allowed people to wear underwear. Before the cotton gin, people wore either wool underwear or went commando. Because most people, and perhaps there are those here who disagree, but most people don't like their underwear with sticky little seeds in it. You know? And cotton has lots of sticky little seeds in it. And it took one person a whole day just to clean the sticky seeds out of 1 pound of cotton. After the cotton gin, this machine would comb out those seeds. And in one day, it could clean 50 pounds of cotton. So cotton went from being something that was prohibitively labor-intensive to refine into something that was accessible, affordable, certainly it was desirable. And cotton quickly became for America what oil is for Saudi Arabia. Cotton accounted for 60% of our GDP. It was our #1 export. There was a cotton boom that caused people to move with their cotton gins and their families and their slaves from the Atlantic seaboard further and further and further west into the Louisiana Territory. They were so desperate for land to grow cotton, this wonder crop, this ticket to success, that some actually emigrated from the United States and moved to Mexico, where they could grow cotton, in a place called Texas. So, cotton, in some ways, really drove the economy. It brought in all this wealth. And if you were a cotton grower, what would you buy first with the wealth? With all the money you made? Maybe more land? Certainly more slaves? And then, I suppose if your holdings became so big that, it really wasn't practical to manage them anymore, maybe you would invest that money. Maybe you would invest it in the northern textile mills, which took southern cotton and spun it into cloth. The cotton gin was the best thing that ever happened to America, in part because it provided such an economic boost to America. It was the worst thing that ever happened to America, in part because it made the southern states even more deeply committed to slavery than they had been before. And an institution which some in the 1780s and 1790s hopefully thought would die out became even more further entrenched. In the North, however, it wasn't slavery, but rather free labor that operated and manned and womaned the textile mills. There were a number of cities that gained fame as being spots where business was booming, especially loudly, and one of those places was Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell had a number of different textile mills, and they were staffed primarily with workers who were young women. And young women from the surrounding countryside, from the farming families of New England, flocked to Lowell to get jobs in these textile mills. And it's kind of interesting because, like my daughter Grace, I don't really want her to work in a textile mill. Like I think she can do better, and I'm not like endorsing the conditions there. I think that there are much safer jobs available today for my daughter Grace. But back then, it was as if these jobs were the best around. Women, for the very first time, could be independent. You didn't need to be part of a farming family to be economically viable. You could work for wages. You were paid in cash. You could take that cash and buy all sorts of neat things with it. I mean, the existence of cash is another thing that I think drives the market revolution. You know, it might take you a while. Let's say you want to buy an iPod, right? It would take you a while to get an iPod if all you had was, I feel almost obligated to say a red paperclip, if all you had was, say, a turkey, you know? Like here you are carrying around this big bloody turkey, which could go bad, like on a hot summer day in North Carolina, and you want an iPod. You need to find someone who wants your turkey more than they want their iPod. That could be difficult. That could be problematic. That's the limitation of a barter economy. But cash has value to everyone, everywhere. And these women are paid in cash. Their money, with which they could make their own decisions, their own choices. They could live independently of a man. I mean, for thousands of years, if not more, women had always been dependent upon a man. And a man had always been dependent upon a woman, right? If you were a girl, you were dependent upon your father. And you ceased being dependent upon your father when you got married. And then you were dependent upon your husband. And if you didn't get married, you were dependent upon your brother-in-law. Right? You needed to be part of a farming family. But now suddenly people could earn wages for work as individuals. And this was extremely appealing to the women of New England who flocked to these textile mills. Davy Crockett, congressman at the time, was fascinated by all that he heard about Lowell. And he took a trip there and he wrote about it. He said in 1834, "The next morning I rose early and started for Lowell. I had heard so much of this place that I longed to see it. I wanted to see the power of machinery wielded by the keenest calculations of human skill. I wanted to see how it was that these northerners could buy our cotton and carry it home, manufacture it, bring it back, and sell it for half nothing, and in the meantime be well to live and make money besides." He arrives and he sees the dinner bells were ringing and the folks pouring out of the houses like bees out of a gum. "I looked at them as they passed, all well-dressed, lively, and genteel in their appearance. Indeed, the girls looked as if they were coming from a quilting frolic." So I have a very clear image of that because I see the quilting frolics all the time. "I went in among the young girls and talked with many of them. Not one expressed herself as tired of her employment or oppressed with work. All talked well and looked healthy. I could not help reflecting on the difference of condition between these females thus employed and those of other populous countries, where female character is degraded to abject slavery. Here were thousands, useful to others, and enjoying all the blessings of freedom, with the prospect before them of future comfort and respectability. So the women who staffed these textile mills, generally teenage girls from probably 15 through 25, were not a permanent labor force. They as individuals were not permanent laborers in these textile mills. It was for them at a time before widespread schooling, kind of part of their education, a way to see the world, a way to leave the farm, a way to broaden oneself, a way to meet others from distant places, a way to have choices, a way to find yourself. And the vast majority of these women, when they reached their early 20s, would return home to either their own community or some other community, and they would get married, and they would have a family. But for a period of time, they had a life that was different than that which had been enjoyed by their mothers and their grandmothers and their mothers before them. They had an opportunity to live as individuals. One of the things that the market revolution makes possible is the rise of the middle-class family, as we kind of commonly conceive of it. You tell me, what's going on in this picture here? Dad's coming home from work, right? Now, from our perspective, this is a sort of like uber traditional kind of scene, you know? Daddy's coming home from work. Mommy was staying at home with the kids. They're all happy to meet Dad. Gosh, Dad. Great to see you, Dad. Thanks for all your hard work, Dad. He all day has been working outside of the home. That's a pretty revolutionary thing. In the 18th century, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, for freaking forever, where did people work? At home, in the dirt outside their house, tilling the soil, raising the crops. The man did it, and the woman did it, and the kids did it. People talk about child labor. That's one of the things that the textbooks really go into. Child labor during the market revolution. Ooh. Again, I'm not going to take Jeff and sign him up for work in a coal mine, unless it pays really, really well. But it's not that the market revolution caused child labor. The market revolution caused the end of child labor. Kids had always been laborers. The vast majority of kids never got any formal education. But with the market revolution, what does Dad do? Dad could be a banker. He could be a lawyer. He could be a doctor. He could be a manager. He could be an engineer. He doesn't look like he is, but he could be an assembly line worker. He could do all sorts of different things that need varying degrees of training, that require varying levels of specialization. Things that may in fact require education. And so, not surprisingly, more and more people are going to start sending their kids to school. More and more children are going to spend their early years learning things rather than working on the farm. And a thing, and historians have written about this, a thing is going to be invented. A thing that we take for granted. But that is, in fact, a new development of the 19th century. And that thing is called childhood. It's called childhood. Like the notion that there's this period that exists before you start laboring and contributing, where you get to develop and play and learn and grow and become self-actualized and win trophies for either really winning or just participating. What does she do during the day? What activities would fill her day? What's that? Yeah, she might help clean the house. She might sew. Watch the little kids. Keep bees. Yeah, I don't know what a gum is either in that quote. It's like a what?
Big prototype last week.
It's like a beehive in a tree. Yeah.
Maybe social events.
Maybe social events, like maybe a book club. Maybe she reads. The printing press is making reading material much more accessible and much more affordable. Back in the olden days, before all this stuff was available online, I would go to the library in grad school and I would use this series called Early American Imprints. And it was in 2 parts. And the parts were put on microcard. So like tiny little print, and you put it in a machine and it would enlarge it and you could see it. And so there'd be like several pages on each microcard, and there'd be boxes full of microcard. And the first series was from, I think, 1630 was maybe the first published thing in America that we still have. First series was 1630 up through 1799. And the second series was 1800 through 1819. The 2 series contained an equal number of titles. There was as much printed in America between 1800 and 1819, in 20 years, as there had been in the nearly 200 years beforehand. Printing presses are churning out more and more text, more and more affordable, more and more accessible. And women, of course, if children need to be educated, America had always had a very high literacy rate, but this is where it really skyrockets, because women need to be able to teach their kids on a fairly sophisticated level. Shockingly, really not shockingly, I'm trying to be sarcastic, it's at this point where we see the development in America of so many colleges, including a number of colleges for women. Women have a vital role to play in this new sort of economy. And the things that the women read cause them to engage in all sorts of different social movements. One book that at the time had sold more copies than any other book except the Bible was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And one of the things that really jump-started the movement for the abolition of slavery. So women are becoming more engaged in the economy as well as in our public life. And it's not surprising, too, that with all the choices that people had in the economic marketplace, with all the choices that they had in the occupational marketplace. I mean, think about that. For thousands and thousands and thousands of years, you knew what you're going to be. You're going to be a farmer. But now, you could define yourself somewhat differently. You could be a lawyer. You could be a doctor. You could be an educator. You could be an engineer. You could be an entrepreneur. Choice was becoming more and more a fact of life, an expectation of Americans in their lives. So, not shocking that at the same time, all of these economic choices are developing. We also see people clamoring for political choice. And I don't want to cross over into the topic that Mike is going to address later on. Democracy, in my eyes, is at best, well, it's not an end in and of itself, right? Democracy is merely a means to an end greater than itself. And the end that's greater than democracy, of course, is liberty. But it's at this point in time when America became more fully democratic. People want to be able to choose the people who govern them. And it doesn't really even make much sense anymore to have land-holding requirements as a test of voting. Because you could be an incredibly successful, incredibly intelligent, incredibly valuable member of society and live in a fabulously luxurious brownstone on an eighth of an acre that perhaps you don't even own. The landholding model just didn't make sense anymore. So by 1830 in America we have universal white manhood suffrage. All the states had removed their landholding requirements. And in religion, you see changes abounding as well. One of the things that Jefferson engaged in with James Madison in Virginia in the 1780s was a drive to disestablish the Church of England in Virginia. At the time of the Constitution's ratification, all the states except Virginia still had an official state church. And of course, the First Amendment didn't deal with the states and their churches. It just prohibited the national government from establishing its own church. They agreed to disagree, right? Different states had different fundamental religions. In New England, people were Puritans, also known as Congregationalists. In Pennsylvania, you have Quakers. In the South, the Anglican Church, or the Episcopal Church, was dominant. Jefferson and Madison thought that it was wrong that Baptists had to pay taxes that went to support Anglican churches. Wrong that Presbyterians had to pay taxes that supported the Anglican Church. Wrong that Jews, wrong that Catholics, wrong that people who believed in other faiths were forced by their government to support a church to which they did not subscribe. And yet, when they pushed for the disestablishment of the Church of England in Virginia, they were attacked by plenty of people who said that without government support, religion would wither. Without government support, this thing that was so fundamentally important, they believed, to our ability to govern ourselves, to our ability to exist as good and moral people, as constructive citizens, as good neighbors. This check upon our avarice, this force for morality, would become increasingly irrelevant if government didn't support it. Jefferson and Madison were like, we're not anti-church. We're anti-having the government subsidize a certain church. We're against religious monopolies. In many states, enforced to varying degrees, people were still required to attend the services of the chosen denomination. It wasn't really even until the middle of the 18th century that things began to change. This guy named George Whitfield, spelled Whitefield, pronounced Whitfield, showed up in America. Good friend of John Wesley over in England, came here. What he preached is less interesting for our purposes here than how he preached. He was a phenomenon. He was a sensation. When Whitfield came to town, and he traveled all up and down the eastern seaboard, when Whitfield came to town, it was like a rock concert. It was like Godstock. It was like Godapalooza, Godaroo, right? It was huge. He preached on Boston Common. Boston at the time, a city of 15,000. 25,000 people showed up on Boston Common. He preached in the Old North Church. The Old North Church was so packed with people who wanted to hear Whitfield that finally, when the sermon ended, when people started to recede from the building, 4 dead bodies fell from the walls against which they had been pressed to death. I mean, this is a phenomenon. And wherever Whitfield goes, if it's on a Sunday morning, where are people not going to be? They're not going to be in the government-authorized, government-sanctioned, government-mandated, government-subsidized, chosen church. And why aren't they there? Because unless you happen to be extraordinarily lucky, they are not there because those preachers, those ministers, suck. They suck. Why do they suck? Well, why does the DMV suck? You know? I mean, where are you going to get better customer service? In a bank? Or at the Department of Motor Vehicles? Even outside of West Point, this tiny, little, miserable, horrible little town, Highland Falls, there are like 5 different banks there. There's choice there. And there's online banking, all sorts of things. There's only one DMV. If you don't like DMV, what are you going to do? You're going to walk. That's what you're going to do. You know? And there was only one choice. Only one church in every town until Whitfield showed up. And he inspired people to imitate him. And there was this rise of all of these new upstart religions. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. Go on into the 19th century. And along the corridor that was the Erie Canal, in the so-called burned over district between Albany and the Great Lakes, burned over because there the fires of perfection burned so hot. More and more people who had liberated themselves from the towns from which they had grown up. More and more people who were moving west to define themselves and define their own lives, making their choices about who they wanted to be, liberated from all of the old authorities of their old towns. These people who were seeking a better life saw a better life not only on earth, but saw a better life after life. And there in this burned over district, you see this incredible creativity, this incredible religious devotion. Even now in upstate New York, you drive through some of these towns, tiny little towns, and there are 5 churches on Main Street. All this choice, all this creativity. You see the rise of Shakers. You see the rise of the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints. You see all of these new religious movements emerging. And think about how powerful this is. I mean, people have the choice. How they want to live, how they want to work, where they want to live, what they want to buy, for whom they want to vote for, and also, maybe most fundamentally, most amazingly, how to define their relationship with God. I mean, just think about how powerful that is. How fundamentally life-altering all of these choices are for the people who so suddenly enjoy them. And this really is a whole new era. And perhaps the greatest testimonial to the success of the market revolution, and the degree to which it transformed people's lives, and the degree to which it brought prosperity to people's lives, is that out of the market revolution, we have our first authentic example of a counterculture hippie. And the person I'm thinking of is who?
Thoreau.
Henry David Thoreau. Right? Thoreau goes off to Walden Pond. And he wants to be independent. He wants to get back to the earth. He doesn't want to rely upon others. He wants to escape the rat race. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, Thoreau tells us. And I can see his point. I see what he means. I mean, why do we go to school?
Learn stuff.
To learn stuff. Why do most people go to school? So that when they get out of school, they can get a good job. They want a good job, why? So they can buy more stuff, like a house in a nice neighborhood. Why do they want a house in a nice neighborhood? So they could raise a family. And they want to live in a nice neighborhood because in that neighborhood maybe there are nice schools, there are good schools, so that their kids can get a good education that will allow them to get into a good college, that will allow them to get a good job, so that they could buy nice houses, so that their kids could get a good education, could get into good colleges, could get good jobs. So that, you get it? You know? Why do you make money? Well, you need a car. Why do you need a car? So you can get to work and make money. Why do you need to make money? You need to buy suits and ties. You need a house that's close in. Thoreau said, F this. You know? I want out. And so he goes off to live at Walden Pond. Now, we know the truth, by the way. We know how hypocritical Thoreau was. because his cabin he built in part with his own hands, but in part with lumber and nails that he bought at Ace Hardware, right? We know that he wasn't really cut off. We know that every Sunday he would go over to the Emerson's house and eat with them and, like talk and eat pies and stuff like that. And we know that this hermit, this person who is too cool for the market, would do what with the memoir that he authored at Walden Pond? Or what would he do? He sold it to someone who used a printing press to mass produce identical copies, all the same, crushing conformity, identical copies of Walden that the publisher had the audacity to sell to people, so that they could buy copies of Walden and carry them around and look cool and, be kind of countercultural themselves. So the market society certainly has its critics. But the fact that Henry David Thoreau could be a professional hippie, could be a professional counterculturalist, says something about what the market revolution makes possible. That you could make a living by being a writer or an artist or in any specialized profession is an amazing new advance, an amazing new development. For the longest time, you didn't have time to develop your skills doing that sort of thing. Why? Because you need to chop wood because it was freaking cold outside. That's why, And there wasn't any cash to buy wood from, and there wasn't anyone who was selling wood because they were too busy skinning chickens or whatever, making soap. So they didn't stink like everyone else did before the market revolution. That would be a wonderful sort of experience for everyone to have, like pre-market revolution smells. The little chamber you walk through, right? It would make a market fan out of anyone. And yet, of course, there is this critique of the market revolution that is really part of the market revolution. People want to make life better. People see all of these changes, and they realize that it is possible to change their lives in so many ways. They don't have to live like everyone else. They don't have to do things like generations before them. They didn't have to be just like their neighbors. And if they saw problems, they could fix them. One of the big movements that's going to come out of the market revolution is the temperance movement. And coffee, our beloved coffee, right, is marketed as an alternative to alcohol. You see the advertisement here. It's called a fragrant cup. It reads, "The truly blessed are those whose scorning drinks pernicious may here refresh their souls with coffee so delicious." And even the little kid, who looks a little bit like Chucky, has his own coffee. In addition to the temperance movement, of course, there's also the abolition movement. Made possible in part by the mass production of printed materials, their cheap and easy distribution. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, begins in the 1830s. It's through print that more and more people share ideas and become aware of the horrors of slavery and call for the either gradual or immediate end to slavery. The market revolution allows us to envision a whole new world. A world that for us is recognizable. A world that for us is understandable in a way that the world before the market revolution kind of isn't. It's really hard to get your head around like the 18th century, to think what it would have been like to live back then. In the 19th century, it begins to change. It begins to be like our world. Real GDP per capita, as we said, doubles during the time of the market revolution. But one of the biggest questions that people ask about the American Revolution is really when it took place. really, when did it end? I mean, the War for Independence we get, 1775 to 1783. But in some ways, did the American Revolution ever end? And I think the same point can just as equally be made for the market revolution. Did the market revolution ever really end? We continue to change. We continue to innovate. Our standard of living continues to trend upward. You think about the wealth that was created during the market revolution. You think about the changes, the improvements that these people got to enjoy. But then think about how things have changed since then. We'll go to our breakout groups, and then we'll come on back. Thanks very much.